confirmation. Our colleagues from Primetime Live were also interested in interviewing the governor and had been asked the same questions. With Mrs. Clinton, in the studio with Sam Donaldson, same answer, sure. Indeed, early this evening, an ABC reporter traveling with Governor Clinton called to say that the campaign was racing to the airport at Manchester, New Hampshire, headed for Washington to appear either on Primetime Live or Nightline. Mrs. Clinton was said to be heading to Washington from Atlanta. A few minutes later, it was all off again. Bad weather in New Hampshire, and it was getting too late. This, though, is clearly a story that the Clintons want to meet head-on together. And they still plan to do that, although not tonight. So what's the story about? Here's Nightline correspondent Jeff Greenfield.
Here we go again. A major contender for high public office is confronted by charges of private wrongdoing.
Do you have any comments about the allegations from Jennifer Flowers?
And here come those same troublesome questions. Are the charges true? Are they relevant? And how should the press cover the story, if at all? The issue emerged today when the Star, a weekly tabloid, revealed that a longtime acquaintance of Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton, who has repeatedly denied any romantic involvement with him, had changed her story. She now alleges that she had an affair with Clinton that ran from 1977 to 1989. The tabloid also said it had tapes of conversations between Clinton and the woman, Jennifer Flowers, although it permitted the press to hear only a fragment of the tape. Campaigning in New Hampshire today, Clinton readily acknowledged that he knew Miss Flowers, but denied any romantic involvement.
I read the story. It isn't true. And I told her over and over, I said, just tell the truth. Tell the truth.
In Atlanta, Hillary Clinton, the governor's wife, also rejected the story.
I just don't believe any of that, and I don't think it's worthy of comment.
On the small portion of the tape that reporters were permitted to listen to, a male voice, the Star says is Clinton, says this to Miss Flowers, quote, "If all the people who are named deny it, that's all. I expect them to come look into it and interview you and everything, but I just think if everybody is on record denying it, you got no problem," unquote. But that conversation by itself establishes nothing. The Star acknowledges it paid Miss Flowers for her story, although it refuses to say how much. For months, Clinton, the leading Democratic presidential contender according to the polls, has been dogged by such rumors. Magazine cover stories have probed the issue. According to Time's Michael Kramer, Clinton hoped the, quote, bogus smoking bimbo, unquote, story would come out early, before he'd gain the nomination. In fact, the issue was the subject of a question from moderator Cokie Roberts during a TV debate in New Hampshire last Sunday.
There's concern on the part of members of your party that these allegations of womanizing, that the Republicans will find somebody, and that she will come forward late, and that you would lose the all-important to Democrats women's vote.
I think it is highly unlikely, given the competitive environment in which I've been in, that you have anything to worry about on that score.
Clinton has even been publicly questioned on whether he ever had an extramarital affair.
Have you ever had an extramarital affair, Governor?
Well, if I had, I wouldn't tell you.
And in the past, Hillary Clinton has had this to say about her marriage.
In any marriage, there are issues that come up between two people who are married that I think are their business.
All this, of course, takes place in the shadow of the Gary Hart story, when the clear frontrunner for the 1988 Democratic presidential nomination was mortally wounded by stories of his extramarital affairs. That uproar forced the press to confront some basic questions. What do you report? When is private conduct relevant to the judging of public officials? Unlike the Hart case, these allegations lack independent substantiation. The excerpts from the tapes the Star will run do not by themselves establish anything, nor is there any way to know whether Miss Flowers has other tapes, which might clearly prove or disprove her allegations. So the mainstream press has held back. Of the major networks, only NBC mentioned the new allegations on tonight's evening newscast, and then only glancingly.
When he was forced to deny tabloid charges of marital infidelity.
CBS and ABC ignored the story. So did CNN. Tom Hannon heads political coverage for CNN.
But there is a threshold, and that threshold has to be, is this credible? Is it grounded in some semblance of fact? And you just can't know that until you take a look at the tapes, you interview the woman, and you assess the story. And for that reason, we're not going with it.
Tomorrow's New York Times, which has buried past allegations about Clinton's private life, carries a very small story about the new charges. Executive Editor Max Frankel.
You can't ignore something that has the potential of causing a crisis in the campaign on the one hand. You can't vouch for a set of accusations that have been paid for by a publication that we don't normally turn to for our news. So you put the two together. You do it as modestly as you can, and you hope you thus signal to the reader that to the best of our ability, we can't vouch for this story, but the campaign is having to face up to something.
Tomorrow's Washington Post plays the story more prominently, but still leads with the denial rather than the allegation. There is a larger debate that's sure to be reignited. Does this aspect of a candidate's private life really tell us anything worth knowing? Are voters entitled to know the most intimate details of a candidate's marital history? Would we have been better off as a nation denying the White House to men like Franklin Roosevelt, John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson? But right now, there's a more immediate question to face. Will the candidate and the press put this issue behind them, or will a vexing question about private conduct once again throw a giant shadow over our public life? I'm Jeff Greenfield for Nightline.
When we come back, we'll be joined by a media critic who says he approaches the Clinton story with a sense of both regret and disgust, by a political consultant whose firm is advising Bill Clinton, and by an expert on politics and the media who says a candidate's private life should become an issue only when it calls into question his fitness for office. New York studio is Jonathan Alter, a senior editor and media critic with Newsweek magazine. From our Washington studio, Mandy Grunwald, a partner with a Democratic consulting firm that is advising Bill Clinton. And from Charlottesville, Virginia, Larry Sabato, a professor at the University of Virginia who's the author of Feeding Frenzy, How Attack Journalism Has Transformed American Politics. An example of the feeding frenzy, Professor?
Absolutely, Ted. I think this is a classic case of lowest common denominator journalism. This is being driven by a sleazy supermarket tabloid. And since when did the New York Times, or for that matter Nightline, allow the subjects it covers to be driven by that kind of news organization?
All right, so let me put you in the position then of managing editor. Pick your own newspaper. And you are now dealing with a story that has not simply appeared in the Star, it's appeared in a number of other places. Not this particular story, but the general accusations of marital infidelity. And here comes a new one, in some detail. You going to ignore it?
Yes, I think you do until you have the proof, until you have the evidence. As far as I'm concerned, these are nothing more than rumors and unsubstantiated allegations. Now, I don't know what the truth is. I have no idea whether any of these charges are in fact true, but I sure know I'm not going to trust the Star to tell me whether they're true.
Jonathan Alter, you have made reference in articles that you have written to the sexual infidelity charges. To the best of my knowledge, none of them has ever been proved.
That's right. There is no proof at this point. It's in the realm of rumor, and I think journalists are justifiably extremely uncomfortable in this area. The Star story today was something you held with asbestos mittens. You know, it was one of those radioactive stories that I don't think anybody really wanted to deal with. But to mix a metaphor, it's like a big elephant sitting in the living room, and when the entire campaign comes to a screeching halt over an issue like this, it's hard to avoid it completely. The challenge becomes to put it in context and not let it crowd out the truly important issues that people are desperate to hear more about from the politicians.
Once it's out, though, Mandy Grunwald, is it ever possible to put it into that kind of perspective, or does it develop a sort of momentum of its own?
Well, programs like this are not a help, Ted. This is the first program that Nightline has done on any topic relating to the Democratic presidential candidates. You haven't been talking about the middle class. You haven't talked about why Bill Clinton has captured people's imagination.
Oh, no,
Here you are.
Wait a second. You're making a charge that's not accurate. We've done a number of programs on the middle class. We've done a number of programs on the issues, unemployment. You're quite right. We haven't done a program on Bill Clinton.
But here we are just a couple weeks before the New Hampshire primary. People are about to go out there and vote. John's absolutely right. They have real concerns. And you're choosing, with your editorial comment, by making this program about some unsubstantiated charges that, as Larry said, started with a trashy supermarket tabloid, you're telling people something that you think is important. That's not context. You're setting the agenda, and you're letting the star set it for you.
All right,
and I find that troubling.
Good. Let me respond to you then, and I tried to put it in the proper context when I began the program. Up until the time that Governor Clinton was prepared to come on the broadcast tonight, or if not this one, to come on Primetime Live, up until it became quite apparent that the campaign fully intends to address the issue, we, I must tell you, we're not going to run this broadcast as we are running it tonight. But if the governor intends to address the issue and the American news media hadn't even told the American public what the issue is, what's he going to be addressing?
He's going to have to answer your questions because, as somebody said earlier in Jeff Greenfield's piece, there were 70 cameras out there. And if he wants to go out and talk about the changes he wants to have happen in this country and the tax cuts he wants for the middle class or anything else, he's not going to be able to do it because all of you are going to have a microphone in his face. And he's smart enough to know that he's going to answer that. He made a statement today. It was a very simple one. He said it wasn't true. And that's not enough for you, and he's going to have to give you a longer answer.
Okay, he has said, Jonathan Alter, that this particular story is not true, but what has been a little bit puzzling is that whenever he is asked more generally speaking about marital infidelity, he has given sort of waffling answers which are not quite as I mean, whether it was the answer to Cokie Roberts, whether it was the answer to that television anchor who said, have you committed adultery? Even his wife has left the impression that there has been something over the last few years. Is that ultimately any of our business? Does it make any difference?
Well, there are a couple of things. First of all, he said that in part so that he doesn't fall into the trap that Gary Hart fell into, where if these charges did happen to be true, he wouldn't be a liar and a hypocrite, because he's explained, and I think appropriately so, that like a lot of marriages, his had its ups and downs. So that puts him in a better position for contending with these charges. Is it any of our business? Fundamentally, I think things that happened a long time ago in this regard are not our business, but you don't know all the threads of the story. Say the Republicans planted this, and there was some evidence of that in last week's charges. That's some kind of a story. Say there were other compromising circumstances that involved jobs or something, and there are charges of that now as well. That could also potentially be some kind of story. So you can't simply write the entire thing off. The goal should be, however, to have it in perspective so it doesn't dominate the entire campaign.
We're going to take a break. We'll continue our discussion in just a moment. Discussion now with Professor Larry Sabato. You said something a little bit earlier in the program that I'd like to follow up on. You seem to be suggesting that the media should not be reporting a story until they have demonstrated it to be true. Is that what you meant to say?
Until they have substantial evidence and proof. There's a difference between demonstrating that it is absolutely 100% true and having substantial evidence and proof. And I also think that that organizations shouldn't be taking their lead from a sleazy supermarket tabloid.
Now, the reason I raise the question is, what do you do if, for example, tomorrow President Bush holds a news conference and talks about that well-known pedophile and drug dealer Ted Koppel? Are my colleagues justified in quoting the president as having said it, whether or not they know it to be true?
Well, I think certainly in that case, Ted, they would certainly quote the president as having said it and then immediately follow it up with 4 packages proving that he's crazy.
Unless, of course, he was smart enough to do it, let's say, at 5:30 in the afternoon so that the evening news programs didn't have time to check it first. I mean, there are all kinds of examples. The media is replete with charges that are made by people and that are reported fully quoting the person who made the charge, but without having had the opportunity to check whether or not the charge is true.
Ted, that's true, but you're ignoring the importance of judgment, of professional judgment. While many reporters like to deny that they are, in fact, professionals, I regard them that way, and I think lots of other people do as well. And they have to make professional judgments about what is important and relevant for the public to know. And some people justify this kind of sleaze by suggesting that they're elitist if they don't tell the public every shred that they know. Well, if that were true, the day wouldn't be long enough to contain 24 hours worth of constant news, because you know a great deal more than you tell.
That's absolutely true. And if, for example, we were to make the decision that we're not going to report this because it's an unpleasant story, I'm not altogether sure whether the public would feel itself well served. Would the public, for example, Mandy Grunwald, have a right to know, and I understand this is hypothetical, if it turns out later on that these charges were true, would the public have a right to know, and would it make a difference if Governor Clinton has been covering up something he knows to be true?
I think you're getting on the wrong subject here. The question is the one that Larry raised, which is your judgment here about who these sources are. You've forgotten in your example with President Bush about the question of money. If President Bush stands up and makes accusations about you tomorrow, if he was paid $100,000 to do it, I think you would ask some questions about his motivation. There's a lot of cash involved in these stories.
You don't know how much is involved. We don't know, so clearly you don't either.
Well, we know that at least $50,000 was offered. Well,
no, you don't.
I'm sorry. I believed Bill Clinton's statement. That's perhaps my bias. We know that the Star has a record, let's put it that way, of paying money for stories, cash for trash. We know that's an element of this story, and I would think you'd be rather concerned before you write these allegations about a man who just might be a good president for this country at a time when we need somebody to make some changes. I think you would want to check out the story a little bit more before you devote a half hour to it.
You're an advisor. Well, we're not devoting a half hour to the story itself. We're devoting a half hour to precisely the kind of discussion.
That's just a neat little way to get at the story.
Really?
I think
well, if that's what we were doing, then we'd be talking about different aspects of it. I mean, so far, you've done a very effective job of putting me on the defensive and asking me questions, which is perfectly appropriate. That's what you're here to do. But the question is whether a story like this deserves to be told, particularly at a time, and you are an advisor to this particular candidate. Let me ask you, if he asked your personal advice, and maybe he did, would you have told him to come on Nightline tonight and confront it, or to come on Primetime Live, or to go on the Brinkley Show on Sunday to confront it, or would you tell him to ignore it?
First of all, I'm not an advisor to Governor Clinton. My partner is. But secondly, yeah, I think he will have to deal with these questions, not because he should and not because I think the American people care. I think they're much more interested in what kind of solutions he's offering, but because you reporters continue to care, he's not going to be able to get his message out until he answers the questions in a fuller way than he has already. I would like to believe that what he said is enough. He said something rather rare already in this campaign. He and Hillary said that they haven't had a perfect marriage. I mean, there aren't a lot of candidates you've talked to who have admitted to not being perfect. I think that's a pretty good start. But they've also said that they've put that marriage back together and that their commitment is to each other and to this campaign and to the country. And I think that ought to be enough. I don't have enough faith in the press to believe that it's going to be.
The press is not like a faucet that you can just turn on and off. People tend to think the press is one thing. It's many news organizations. A lot of people think that Geraldo is the press. So you're dealing with an essentially uncontrollable situation, which contributes to the sense of, I think, real sadness that a lot of reporters have about this, that this is the way life is in American politics now. So all we can do is kind of move ahead and try to put this new sense of the way things work in a context that gives them the right sense of proportion. Where Mandy might be right is that we all do, and I'm partially guilty of this myself, essentially get the details through customs as a media story. It is a media story, but we are also a little bit hypocritical in not admitting that we are, in fact, spreading it even when we discredit it.
All right, Larry.